What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I'm the design lead of Summoner's Rift Team's live pod, and I'm here to talk to you about patch 25.14. Let's go. No big preamble topics. So first things first, I will give another update on how behavioral systems work is going. We put in for review 3 different, I'm going to call them detection types in the last patch. I'm going to be intentionally vague because we don't want people to dodge our detection methods, right? So we put in 3 sort of umbrella sort of detection types. One of them was basically unusable, and then 2 of them were pretty good, where it's like, okay, I understand where we're getting false positives. Basically, we pull a bunch of replays of games where the detection triggered, or the detection like criteria plural triggered. It's like, okay, we may have punished a player for what happened in this game, and here are the timestamps where like the thing existed, or this is a game where it got flagged, go review the game, right? And so we kind of go through and like, okay, well, are we detecting the appropriate things? And so we basically say, are there bugs with detection? Like, are we seeing the behavior we expect to see? And then, is this behavior the kind of thing that we would actually want to punish, or send a warning for, or not, whatever. So one of them, essentially basically unusable. It was way too inaccurate to be ever like really usable in production. So we said, okay, well, we tried, it's fine, move on. For the other 2, there were like minor bugs we knew we could fix, but even for like version 1, which had some like tuning issues and whatnot, they were like, oh, we're getting way more positive than negatives. That's good. And so the version 2 of each of these are going into this patch. We will pull the replays, we will review, and the hope is that we'll have some more detections ready to actually action in about a month's time when we review the 0.14 stuff. We might need to do another review or another rendition for 0.15, get everything attached. Hopefully it works out pretty well, but hey, I just want to point out that some of the stuff that I've been working on has gone into the game, and we're sort of iterating towards them actually getting turned on for actually doing stuff. Otherwise, there are a lot of other things going on in the behavioral system space. That said, I am not in charge of BSIS. I'm just here doing some work. And so even though I'm aware that other people are doing stuff, and there's some really cool stuff kind of going on, it's not just, oh, find out how someone's feeding, whatever. There's some really cool stuff people are doing. But I only have so much time in the day to like look at stuff. And so I'm not super up to date. I just know that when I see the occasional updates and stand-ups and whatnot, I'm like, oh, cool. We're progressing towards some pretty cool stuff here. So just kind of want to shout out that other people in BSIS are doing some really cool stuff that hopefully you will start to see pretty soon, and that will ideally materially improve your experience playing the game. Let's move forward. So as for gameplay stuff, this is almost all really short term, like was done over the last 2 weeks kind of work, or the last couple of days in some cases here. So we're going to start with game systems. So up first, champion bounties. What's funny is I put these changes in before, I think it was Coach Rogue made a YouTube video about where champ bounties are at right now. Ultimately, I had felt that they were a little bit too finicky, and that it was still a little bit too, they didn't quite match sort of player expectations a couple of times. So reducing the amount of bounty you get from purely farming, so it's going to be more about your kills and assists overall, and basically stretching out bounty suppression. It's a really, really tight window to be in, where, especially relatively early on, games can swing pretty aggressively back and forth. And so, like, what determines a team is meaningfully winning from a team is not meaningfully winning is often, like, relatively narrow. In addition, how am I trying to say this? Right, so it can swing pretty wildly, but also at the same time, it's like, well, you also want to be able to look at the scoreboard and be like, yeah, based on how this game is going, I would expect the 5-0, Pantheon to have a bounty on its head. And then, like, you get a double kill in top lane and a minion wave, like, well, that's a lot of gold and a lot of experience. That's over 1,000 gold, which is usually a large portion of the gold lead. And you're like, oh, there's a scoreboard again. And it's like, well, yeah, the team is no longer winning by a ton. I no longer expect Pantheon to have a bounty on his head. And so what's kind of tough is that sort of threading needle between the game is close enough, the game is not close enough, but also my bounty keeps fluctuating wildly, is a very, very narrow needle to thread. Ultimately, this is stretching it out on both ends. And so what that means is how much you have to be winning to fully turn off suppression is a little bit farther in, to be winning by a little bit more. At the same time, starting the suppression narrowing at all is going to be a little bit lower. And so you're going to start, like, you will see people go down from max bounty, right, a little bit higher up in gold lead, and you'll see people be above 0 at slightly lower gold amounts in some cases. And so hopefully this ends up being a really good spot where it doesn't seem quite so flickery, but it still feels like the bounties that are supposed to exist do in fact exist. Next thing is a tuning update to Guardian. This is aimed at being power neutral for the average tank who runs it. Braum being the key example, I literally pegged it to Braum's normal rune page and item choices. And on the other side, trying to make it slightly better for enchanters, because it's meant to be that not necessarily Guardian is dominant, but that Guardian is a bit more viable for enchanter picks, and so trying to split a bit of difference there. And so the change is an increase of 0 to 30 in the base shield. Obviously, you're not going to get 30 shield all the time. That's level 18, but it is a nudge in that direction. It is a 2.5% ability power ratio increase as well, 20% larger scaling from AP. And then the way the math works out essentially is 30 more shield versus 3% bonus HP. This is the AP scaler, this is the bonus HP scaler. This is, the same thing on this side. That should roughly equal out for someone like Braum, and it will pretty clearly be power positive for an enchanter. We'll see if it's going to be enough power. It might not, but the goal is to make it slightly better on enchanters, as it doesn't really appear to be getting any pick rate on those champions right now. Other change is changing the trigger condition to be a little bit more willing to turn the shield on in case we're getting a little bit of chip damage at a time. So ultimately, having to take 90 damage often means that it wouldn't, block, like, I'm going to hit you with an Elise Q or something, or I'm going to, throw down, whatever, like a Lucian Q or whatever. It's like moving the number to a point where it's actually going to probably block that spell's damage. One thing I noticed when I looked at the patch history of this rune is that we had changed a lot of the base shielding values without often changing the trigger numbers here as well. And the trigger numbers when the rune came out were much closer to the actual shield value. And that had kind of moved off over time. And so I went from the shield is roughly twice, right? You have to take about roughly twice the shield damage to trigger to about 10% more than the shield value to trigger, which to me is appropriate. And even if your Guardian doesn't block all the damage, like rather it pops and the shield was, another 5% larger or whatever, to me that's still better than you just take damage and nothing happens. So to me that is correct, but I guess we'll see. Next one is a strict or a direct nerf to Unsealed Spellbook. What's funny here is actually the tooltip has been out of date for a while. The tooltip is actually hard-coded, which means by the time we decided to make changes here, we didn't want to do emergency localization for the phrase smite damage increases after 2 TWO swaps. Like, it's not even looking up a variable. It's like just writes out the number 2. And it's like, actually, no, it increases damage after every single swap and can increase damage twice. So I was like, well, the tooltip is heavily inaccurate on live right now. We can at least improve that state. And ultimately said, you know what I believe to be the case here is that smite should not be sort of like obviously better than jungler's smite. So the actual like resulting change here is simply that instead of smite going, if you swap one summon before you go into smite, it's 900. If you swap 2 summons before smite, it's 1200. Now it's if you swap 2 summoners, it's 900, and there's no 1200, you can never have better smite than the jungler itself. And the timing here also tends to mean that even if a jungler is doing kind of poorly, you will not get 900 smite before them. You have 600 smite at the same time as them, right? Of course, and you can have 900 smite at the same time as them if they're not doing too well. If they're really power farming, they beat you here. But ultimately saying, no, I don't really like that. That going into Unsealed Smite can actually be better than either team's jungler. To me, that's a bit too high, and so it's a very, very small nerf here. Right, the number of times this really matters is pretty low, but and like I don't mind that a team runs 2 smites and has a 2100 true damage instant cast secure. Like that's the rune. You're grabbing this rune for the things that the rune does, such as giving you smite and giving you ignite, exhaust, whatever. And I hope it doesn't feel too cruel to say that, hey, you never quite get big smite the way you can get big, ignite or whatever, and it's the same power level. But to me, this seems a little bit more like a protected class sort of thing, but that you're allowed to grab smite because of what the thing tells you it can do. I think you could have different opinions from me around what the appropriate numbers here are meant to be for Spellbook and what it's meant to be around smite, but this is what I believe, and so it's what I chose to do for the change here, and so it's what's going into the game. Hunting guys, we're changing it to be unique to 1 per inventory. I'm actually pretty convinced this isn't truly overpowered. You lose a lot of damage going here relative to simply buying a Liandry's. In fact, if you want this build, oftentimes you can just do like Haunting Guys, get a extra Ruby Crystal, and then go build your Liandry's or whatever, or Riftmaker, and that would be decent as well. But at the end of the day, it's the kind of thing that I would say like sort of looks wrong to players. I remember we had this 12 years ago with Vladimir stacking Hextech revolvers, which gave Omnivamp or Spellvamp, I think. I think it was Spellvamp, and it wasn't actually good, and so people were baiting themselves into doing it, but it was frustrating to face against, and it's like, oh, it's a slam dunk to unique them then, because it's not like we're actually really restricting proper strategic choices. We're just, it's annoying to face, and so it looks kind of wrong, and so screw it, it's kind of free here. So that's a short version of the description of why this is the change here. I think there's totally a world where you say, hey, we re-add the unique passive text to items and just be like, no, this buff just doesn't stack. You can buy 2 Haunting Guises. The item tells you it's unique. You're allowed to make mistakes. And I do think it is reasonable, by the way, to let players make mistakes if the mistake is relatively obvious. And it's like, yeah, this thing says unique on it. Just read the text. That is, I think, actually good and useful overall. It's probably good for the game. But again, we made a lot of these changes on Monday. That is after our localization lock. And so being like, saying this item is unique, it requires changes that just in the back end of the scripting be like, you just literally can't hold more than 1. By the way, this does not change what happens if you build a Leandries and start building Riftmaker. You can have new Haunting Eyes. These aren't going to be, funky in that regard. But in terms of like holding exact Haunting Guises, that itself is no longer possible. Next is ultimately a pretty small buff to Rod of Ages. It is 100 flat mana on the item. It is another 10 mana per stack, meaning 200 total extra mana by the end when it's fully capped out here. Ultimately, Rod of Ages had a perception issue. It was nerfed because it was a little bit too OP when we like buffed Catalyst and whatnot, and it was something like, oh my gosh, Roe is the best item in the game via a small Catalyst buff. That like truly wasn't that big of a deal, I don't really think still. And that made us have to nerf the item to a point where the item was arguably actually weak, which hurts all the typical old school Roa users like Rise and Kassadin and Anivia and whatever. And so it's like, well, a lot of the reasons these champs have historically been Roa champions and are still Roa champions is they actually use the entire mana pool. And one thing that aligns with Rod of Ages, the item, is it's an item that gives basically a Juggernaut level of health and durability overall. Not only the 400 something health in the item, but you level up and gain 5 armor and 1.5 MR from the extra level as well. And so the total throughput on durability there is very, very high. Roa is functionally kind of a Juggernaut item. And if you're going to play a long-term combat, like with Roa, all the healing and health and whatnot, you actually might run out of mana. And so, and just additionally, again, the champs used to build Roa back in the day, especially the Roa Seraphs champs. It's like, yeah, Rise and Cassiopeia and Benivia and Kassadin can all so an actual mana buff to Roa is a buff that matters for these champions and truly rarely matters for like whatever your TF build is doing or whatever. So a targeted buff aimed at helping historic Roa users, that's the point there, because the item is slightly weak on those champions, and it should be like pretty clearly BIS on them as far as I'm concerned. Blade of the Ruin King getting a strict buff here. It's plus 1% current health damage, both to ranged and melee users. Not much else to say, except we're making the item stronger overall, buffing the on-hit 80 carry item space, basically. This, of course, also affects melee on-hit users as well, so congratulations, Bork is stronger. Kraken Slayer, similar boat here. This item is actually just kind of weak. That said, there aren't that many on-hit champions out there, but it should ideally be competitive with Blade of the Ruin King. And the really meaningful fork here is meant to be that Blade of the Ruin King is clearly when you're hitting other tankier targets and you want to kind of sustain against them, and it's valuable for that kind of gameplay. Kraken Slayer is specifically about, after the couple of reshapes have gone through so far, and I'm not going to say the item is perfectly designed by any means, because I don't think we've really like gone in and designed the item from the ground up and been like, are we happy with everything with this item? It's just kind of been inherited, and that's not great, of course. But I think it is in a decent enough spot where it's like, no, this item is about you finishing off squishier champions. And so, right, it's this damage amp against lower health champions, right, where you do up to 1.5x the on-hit damage based on how low they are. Now it's up to 1.75x how, damage based on how low they are. Another one where localization lock kind of got in the way, where I think Ideala's item caps its math at like 70% missing health, and that is where you're getting the max damage amp there. It's linear down to 0 HP, which is probably not correct, but it means we should have a reminder tooltip around that you hold shift and it goes, hey, damage is maxed at 30% target health, right? But again, a lot of things getting into localization lock. This is some of the downside of not having as aggressive staffing on live, is we don't catch these things until it's basically time for reactive balance. We're like, yeah, the item is weak. Okay, well, all the tools we might use to make a higher quality change, we don't have available because we're meeting on Monday as a reactive balance thing. End of the day, we can still sort this out. We can still try to figure out and do better, but ultimately, these are some of the things we kind of lose when we move resourcing around, just trying to be transparent around things that we gain, things that we lose, whatever. Kraken Slayer could have had slightly better changes if we had done it with more forethought, but again, no one's doing a lot of that forward thinking right now, or very few people are. 100 gold cheaper here as well. Kraken Slayer, I think ultimately, this buff here is just pretty small, and so 100 gold off to me matches what I think this item needs in terms of buffs. Finally, we have Phantom Dancer. I think ultimately, with us having 4 Zeal items, and Yuntal Wild Arrows existing, means that there's just not that much appetite for a large number of attack speed crit items. Now, you have champions like Lucian, where their first slot is not Yuntal, and so they go into Flickerblade. You have a couple of champions who just actually can use that much attack speed. For example, Jinx has really poor attack speed during Rocket, so actually is happy to have Hurricane plus Yuntal in her build. But in a lot of cases, it's like, yeah, it's just really narrow trying to be a Zeal item in modern League of Legends when Lethal Tempo is very popular, when Yuntal is very popular, and the average AD carry cannot kite at 2 attacks per second anyway. And even then, mathematically, it's not even always optimal to do that, even if you could do this mechanically well. And so there is a lot kind of headwinds here against Phantom Network, don't get me wrong, but ultimately the item does appear pretty weak. Now, I want to be clear, this is basically a direct buff to Ashe and a direct buff to Garen. These champions are both buying this item quite a lot, and so that's just going to be true, of course. But the point here is PD is kind of weak. It doesn't have any other users when it probably could woo the occasional champion here. It seems to be one of the worst items you could buy as a bot lane AD carry, and so a buff here. We go on to miscellaneous champion changes. First up, there is a big Kled update. This would have been ready last patch, but I made the call that was pretty quickly reinforced by other leadership that was like, no, we're not going to do a Kled update on the MSI patch. If we get it wrong, that's a pretty bad thing. Ultimately, though, if you want to go see what went into this, Nstep has a video on his channel. If you want to go see all his considerations, what went into the Kled update, we've got that there. Otherwise, looks really cool. Basically, make Kled a better fighter. Hopefully, it's going to be really, really positive. Seems to be well received from what I've seen from Kled players, so hopefully this goes over well and people are happy. I did manage to get the Bel'Veth recommended runes update in. This is just kind of miscellaneous, but it's there. Changing one of her Rec Rune pages from Lethal Tempo to PTA, and then changing all the attack speed shards to adaptive force shards. I did that Wednesday morning, so unless something went weird, that is the normal procedure that gets it to get picked up correctly. So we will likely see a small, I'm going to say like 0.5, probably under 1% win rate lift to Bel'Veth here. But yeah, I think it'll be a very small update that'll make Bel'Veth a little bit, like, not technically stronger, but perform better in the hands of more novice players. And then one thing that I want to bring up here, I saw someone ask, like, wait, where's the Pantheon nerf? What's going on? This is another case of running into localization lock where we do want to nerf Pantheon, and we will nerf him in 0.15. But the way his Q rules tooltip is written is it says, like, Q deals variable % increased damage to jungle monsters. And it's like, well, the right change is going from like plus 10% to like minus 10%. And so saying deals minus 10% increased damage to jungle monsters, I understand you could be like, just leave it in the game, dude, it's fine. But, and we could have asked for emergency localization. That is something that is available to us, but it's frowned upon and it hurts other people's workflows. And ultimately it's like, okay, Pantheon's going to be OP in the jungle for another 2 weeks. That is a, to me, relatively low price to pay. I think it's not that big of a deal. He's not like 45% ban rate champ. He's not like astronomically highest win rate. Like, yes, sure, he looks the best competitive. He's obviously very, very reliable. Sure, of course. There's totally room to nerf this champion, and we should nerf the champion, right? But the game is not on fire at this Pantheon power level. It's not. Let's not be hyperbolic. He's very good. He's a bit OP, and it's like we can wait 2 weeks and just make the right change, which is update the tooltip, make sure localization is insulated against further changes to this tuning lever, and just do the right change. So we'll put it into 0.15. Probably the day that 0.15 PvE deploys, we'll have the change here. We're gonna nerf him in 2 weeks. All right, on to the other sets of changes, though. Our last several patches have been really buff-heavy. Ultimately, we're probably still not going equal on the ledger here in terms of buffs versus nerf, which means we are, unfortunately, I mean, to the tune of, like, 5 champions over the roster 170, we've, like, lightly power-crept the game, assuming that our changes are all equal power level, which I'm not sure is really true, but regardless, we'll move on. So we're nerfing Braum. The person who's doing the changes wanted to nerf his durability overall. I suggested to reduce flat armor. I think overall reducing some early game armor from support tanks is correct. I think I've told the story before. I'm going to tell again. When Runes Reforged came out, the compensation stat package that every champion got was functionally, what is your current page? We're going to compensate you with that. That's essentially the TLDR what happened. And of course, because AD carries were the primary thing in bot lane, you had a lot of supports who are running like armor in Quints and oftentimes armor in Seals as well. And so they all got like 22 level 1 armor. And I think that contributes somewhat to how strong mages are in bot lane and how often we have to rebalance things around bot lane versus mid lane mage performance. Now, that's not always true, and not everyone's going to hold the same opinion as me. I do think, by the way, it is reasonable that mages are viable in bot lane. I think that is fine. I think there is a frequency at which it is going to be too high. But last I did the numbers, it's something like around like 11% of all bot lane picks are like clearly bot lane marksman coded champs. So this is like Neela counts as the 89% here, for example. But like Yasuo is part of the 11%, and Karthus and Ziggs and whatever are part of the 11%, right? And it's like, that's a pretty small number, all things considered. And so like, look, if it's 25%, that like, at the end of the day, it comes down to what do players actually enjoy doing and what do players actually want to engage with. I think it is important that you can play more than just 80 carries down there. I think it's actually really, really, really valuable. I don't want that number to go to like 5%. But somewhere in the 10%-ish range, I think is very reasonable, unless there becomes a much larger appetite around playing Swain, Karthus, whatever. If they start becoming really popular, not just because they're OP, then cool, we can keep opening the gates more and more. But considering how much live work we've had to do around rebalancing champs around bot lane, and like the mid lane power level can't be there or whatever else, I'm pretty sure that we're meant to continue to tap down things that are going to be mage power skewed and, you know, stay around that 10% non-traditional bot lane size, and everything else kind of around there. So Braum, flat armor, that is kind of the logic behind pushing there. Lee Sin, pretty simple. The last thing we made were meant to be somewhat pro skewed. We'd love if Lee Sin was just sort of like in the pro meta at a more normal for solo queue balanced state. And so I'm quite happy with the changes that we made last time around to his E and everything. But we're simply going for minus power here. We know Lee Sin a bit too good for what he's supposed to be in solo queue. Minus 380 is very, very simple. It'll affect his jungle clear some, but his gank power like is, I think, more important. And so hoping that this trade overall ends up with a sort of net positive state where he's a little bit more in pro play and about the same power level that he was in solo queue. Riven, pretty clearly one of the strongest top laners in the game. She certainly is very highly indexed on number of mains, but like there's no champion where 90% of their players are like mastery 50. Riven, like any champ in the game, gets win rate suppressed by novices. They all do. Riven, if you account for only high mastery players, is one of the strongest top laners in the game. Targeting a nerf to her late game. The person who did this change wanted to nerf her passive. I suggested that we go after the late game passive because, to me, Riven players really care about their early agency, and so asked that we, you know, the total magnitude of change is fine. It's whatever. You know, let's go for about somewhere between like 0.75 and 1% win rate. But asked that we keep the early game as equal as possible, and so doing that here. Pretty much just a linear nerf here, 0 to 10% total AD on the passive. Set, pretty simple change. Set tends to be low MMR skewed, so any growth stat will tend to also be low MMR skewed. Minus 0.5 armor growth, going to be about 1% win rate, no big change there. TF, again, we buffed them for MSI, of course. Going to walk back a little bit of power there. Take 10 damage off Q. Cool. Keep the AP ratios there. Let him build ability power. Feel good about that one. Don't have him just be a utility bot. So if his gold skilling's still there, he goes and builds gold. Goes and builds damage with his gold. Okay, great. Yasuo is actually our one compensation nerf because of buffing Blade of the Rune King and Kraken Slayer. Everyone else is just going to keep an eye on and see what goes on here. But Yasuo is at one of his highest sort of win rates right now. He was actually a potential nerf target as well for 0.13 or 0.12. But we're like, well, there's the outside chance we get some Yasuo at MSI, so we're going to leave him until after the patch. And then here we go, we got the nerf in. Yumi is a nerf here as well. It's actually been, this is now her third nerf in a row, but she's pretty resilient to these nerfs overall. He's doing quite well, better than she probably should be, a ban rate threat in a lot of places as well. And so trying to bring down a lot of our sort of like late game team fight carrying snowballing. The math behind Yumi are, by the way, I know I'm just like showing you 5% R AP ratio. It's like per wave, by the way, and that is like further multiplied by best friend bonus as well. Mathematically, Yumi R is really, really AP ratio skewed. It's where a lot of the power actually comes from. And of course, she builds ability power in most slots here, at least on most builds. I know some people go for like, non-AP builds, but for the most part, she's building AP in most slots for most people. And so this is actually a fairly big deal because it's per wave and before the best friend multiplication. So it's a 1/3 cut to the R AP ratio. We'll see. If it's not enough magnitude, we can always refollow, here, but this should be pretty meaningful. And from experience, players will tend to see ultimate nerfs as really large, even if the win rate impact is not that huge. So in this case, we're talking about 1%. Zoe is probably, I think for a high elo solo queue, the like winningest mid laner in the game for players who know what they're doing. That's not quite true, but it's like, of like, normal mid lane champions, I would say arguably the winningest high elo mid lane champion. There's like random stuff out there, like Kale is still very good, for example, in most elos. Anyway, the point here is Zoe is kind of like the best laner in the game, 1 through 5, and no one can really contest her. But it feels miserable to play Zoe after like 20 minutes when you fall off a cliff. And so I did some looking at Zoe's numbers before summer break last week, and then we grabbed Zoe for nerfs here, which I think is pretty worthwhile. I was like, oh, okay, I'd already been looking at some of this, so I had some ideas. So I grabbed this as one of the changes I was going to do. And the goal was to, like, of course, nerf her early game and try to give her a little bit back in the late game. Not this like that this 5 AP ratio is going to like save her late game, make her playable there, but the more we can kind of smooth things out. And I think there's a lot of value in just in general being low risk, making sure the balance changes do what we want, and like, hey, we're just nudging things in the right direction little by little. And so it's minus 15 damage on W that's combined across 3 bolts. 5% AP ratio back means 300 AP breaks even. That is about 3 items on Zoe. That's, again, not worse in all points in time, but clearly I would say win rate negative. But a 75 damage ability is like, yeah, I just walk at you and ignite at level 1, and so I ignite for like 75 or so damage, and I get W for 75 or so damage. Is like, of course I win the trade. What are you going to do? You can't win. And similarly here, like taking 5 damage off Q. It is at level, I think, 14 or 15. It is no longer a nerf at all. I'm nerfing the level scaler on the ability. And so it's nerfed by 5, then 4 for a while, then 3 for a while, then 2 for a while, then 1. And then like level 15, it's the same number as before. And so by that point in time, like your Q is unchanged. Your W has a higher AP ratio than before. And so her late game is slightly stronger than before. We're not going to like change this 13% win rate by game time curve. It's going to be like maybe 11%. But incrementally going in that direction, going to like maybe 6% at the lowest. I would not try to go to like flat, but like, you know, incrementally moving anytime we need a buff or a nerf, just like going from around 13 to like around 6, 7, 8, something around there. Right, we can move in that direction and over time kind of go towards, she's an early game champion, she's good at laning, but like it's not hopeless against her, and it's not hopeless when she's trying to play late game out. On the champion buffs, we have some buffs to Azir here. There is a decent chance that, so this is probably going to be around like 1.6% win rate or so. Azir is probably meant to be very lightly win rate suppressed. What I mean by that is a few things. So one, Azir is not a Riven or a Yasuo where a disproportionate number of players are mains. Again, not like 90% by any means in those cases, but Azir is not a disproportionate mains kind of champion. And so because Azir is hard, he is always going to be win rate suppressed because he doesn't have disproportionate mains and is hard. So you will typically never see 50% win rate because he never deserves it because of player-based metrics. The other is Azir is probably, arguably, the kind of champion that, much like Ezreal or Lee Sin, where you look at champion win rate, you compare it against mastery and go, oh, those champs aren't as strong as other champions. But you look at how the champion plays out games, and you're like, they don't need that win rate to feel strong, to feel like they're doing what they're supposed to do for their players, and to feel fair to play against because they have so much agency in everything that they do, right? And it's usually these very high mobility champions. Oftentimes it can be resetting champions as well. Viego's also here. Where like Viego might look like the strongest solo queue jungler in the game. By win rate on high mastery Viego players, he's bottom 3rd. And yet Viego players are playing him. Viego opponents thinks Viego is good. And I think Azir is often going to be a kind of champion like that, where even a post-mastery win rate measurement should be suppressed a little bit because he has so much control over how the game flows. And that tends to align with player expectations, both playing as and against. Mathematically, unless we really overshoot what we think this buff is, Azir is going to be in a like lightly win rate suppressed state, which is really just saying, we're not measuring purely by, we're not going to balance the game purely by numbers. That would be very stupid. We're going to try to balance the game such that champions are the appropriate power level for the game they are playing. We think there's going to be appropriate power level for Azir, for solo queue. There is a world where he's the best mid laner in the game in pro. We'll see what happens in the rest of Summer Split if Azir is 100% ban rate and has to be nerfed out for pro, but we'll see. Next change is going to be to Darius. Darius slightly on the weak side here. We are going for a bit of team fight output, a bit of scaling into, later into the game output, as opposed to I just crush you 1v1 harder. And so it's missing health per hit on Q. This is only ever 1, 2, or 3 hits. So it's up to 6% missing health on a really well aimed Q or Q flash or whatever, which should be a bit more of a team fight output thing, and hopefully gives him the right amount of power without making him more overbearing in lane, as some champions can actually beat him. Next is Fiora. This was a bit of a journey back and forth. I was misinformed, I guess by someone who else was misinformed. Ultimately, what's going on here is, Fiora R was bugged as of about 2 years ago to always last 5 seconds, but the amount of healing over those 5 seconds was properly prorated based on the number of vitals triggered. That bug was introduced 2 years ago. Otherwise, it was correct for the last 10 years before then, or 6, 7, 8 years before then. So a change went in and said, oh, well, it always lasts 5 seconds, and so earlier before break, someone came in, made a change, said, okay, the visuals will not always last 5 seconds because they heal for 5 seconds, and it'll remove the tooltip mention of scaling with vitals because it didn't scale with vitals. And then as time went on, we're like, oh, actually, you were mistaken. This did, in fact, have reduced healing impact, and so, no, this is not a tooltip only fix. This is a gameplay impacting change. And by the time we ultimately fully realized that, it was like, oh, we're past localization lock, but let's make a good choice here. We can still go for emergency loc if it's important. We can do whatever we need to do. We can figure stuff out, right? Because you can always revert back to the old files and be like, just use the old tooltips. It's fine, right? That's fine. We're not gonna impact someone else's work stream, right? End of the day, I believe that Fiora should have full value R. That this sort of team fight skewed output. I landed 1 vital and we blew up the guy that we blitzcrank hooked or whatever. Yes, I just watched LPL an hour ago, or MSI an hour ago. It's a Fiora blitzcrank in a game. Yes, they're different teams. I don't care. The point is, that is a cool output that I think is reasonable to give fighters. It is actually a very good thing to give fighters who are often very 1v1 skewed some kind of team-wide output. It is why Black Cleaver is such a clever design that got repurposed from being an AD carry item back in 2009 to being a fighter item in modern day, which is hey, one of the outputs of being a fighter is I shred for my team, and I have this light incentive to join with them and be helpful with them. And a lot of the shape of their items is around withstanding of damage to get the first reset, Death Stance, and a little bit of Stare, kind of like this. And so having some kind of cooperative output to a suite of champions who are often very much not cooperative or do not work well in large team environments is a good change. And so saying, hey, Fiora, let's bring your R back to what it is, which is we pop this, even if I only trigger 1 vital and the champion dies, we get to put up the heal. It's full value team fight output. I think that is generally a good thing. Yes, this of course is a direct power positive change, and Fiora is honestly one of the strongest solo queue top laners in the game right now. She is, by mastery win rate data, very, very high. Does not mean she's meant to be neutral or high or low or whatever. I don't have a strong opinion on that one right now, but regardless, we are ultimately fixing the visuals to last 5 seconds because the heal lasted 5 seconds no matter what, and functionally buffing the heal itself to always go max value instead of 40 to 100% based on the number of vitals triggered before it popped off. Meant to be teamfight skewed, it will be power positive, and we will measure to see how well Fiora is doing afterwards, and if we need to make nerfs down the line, we certainly can. Making some buffs to Fizz. So the first line here is a bit of a misleading one. If you last hit with W, you reset the cooldown to about under 1 second anyway, and so this doesn't do anything. If you do not last hit with W, you have a buff on yourself that lasts for a while, and this cooldown doesn't go on until that happens either. So there's 2 cases where the Fizz W cooldown is fake. But there are cases where it will go on cooldown and you want to get it back. And this can matter for things like Lichbane timings, or just in general, if Fizz wants to go fight, when the W buff is gone, he comes back and gets used it again. That is useful, right? That is stuff that matters here. And so, yeah, this is good. This is nice to have. This is a positive. This gives Fizz something to do and keep fighting, and that is kind of a good thing overall. 5 AP ratio on the E, also positive here. Good stuff. Great. Power positive Fizz, he's ultimately in a kind of weak spot right now. There is room for build optimization. It's actually not in... he should really be going Lichbane every time. People are going Ludens and doing really badly at it. So there's, some win rate loss. But even beyond that, we think Fizz can sustain a buff here. Final buff here is to Ziggs. It is technically some adjustments, but we're pretty confident it's win rate positive. So Q is losing 5 damage, but is getting a -5 to +15% AP ratio buff, which is clearly win rate positive, I would say. E is getting no change to the base damage here, but getting a -5 to +15% AP ratio buff to the E damage. And then R is getting a very, very light reshape of gaining, for the sweet spot, center damage, +0/50/100, but a 10% AP ratio nerf, which is a nerf slash 500 AP slash 1000 AP, which realistically, this is basically power positive as long as you get level 11. The goal here is for all these changes to be shaped toward mid lane, to have him care about experience. That is the goal, right? The goal is to have him care more about experience, to make a better mid laner than bot laner. As bot lane Ziggs is kind of bad, and mid lane Ziggs is atrocious. And we did this change about 2 or so years ago to Veigar, and by stretching out his Q, his W, and R to scale AP ratio with rank up, it was a 1.5% mid lane versus bot lane win rate skew. It was like clear as day, very obviously very, very, very good at that. And so in the Veigar case, it was rank 1 is weaker, rank 2 is equal. Rank 1 is weaker, rank 4 is equal, rank 5 is a buff. And that ended up being power neutral on mid lane and power negative, win rate negative on bot lane. And so because Ziggs deserves win rate here, it's negative on 1, equal on rank 2, and then of course a buff on rank 3 through 5. And so the implication here is that it's going to be win rate positive and ideally heavily skewed toward mid lane. Not much else to bring up here right now. I think ultimately, like, this was just meant to be low scope, very easy. Here's some win rate that is directly in every single situation skewed towards that lane. I still do want to examine Ziggs mana at some point, but right now it's not happening. I think there's totally a world where Ziggs needs to be a bit more durable early game. Because when I look at Ziggs bot, he doesn't tend to die. He's just too far away to be threatened. Whereas Ziggs mid actually gets interacted with and actually gets killed a fair bit. They both still have push long term and kill turret, but Ziggs mid actually dies. Ziggs bot doesn't tend to. And so early durability might matter here. Moving some mana around with level scaling might go there as well. But this was meant to be simple power positive in known levers that we know are mid lane skewed. Like, I believe early health is likely mid lane skewed. I believe mana growth is likely mid lane skewed. But like, I'm not 100% on that one. Whereas we know from historics with Veigar, it's likely going to be fine. So that's that kind of change here. That's going to be the patch. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.